When I lived in Israel, I had an opportunity to look closely at the archaeological environment. I quickly realized that this field of science is sometimes used politically or to justify a specific worldview. Much more often, it is done by people who have little idea of how archaeology works, which leads to bizarre conclusions. On the other hand, we need to remember that archaeology is a limited science that can only present us with some historical fragments and not a complex and subjective picture of ancient history. Therefore, there is a strong temptation to match what you discover with your personal beliefs. In today's episode of our series focused on Jerusalem history, we will take a closer look at some statements that refer to ancient history. At the same time, I would like to emphasize that our series is also subjective, as it is based on biblical narrative that shapes our archaeological understanding. This means that we tailor archaeological finds to a specific biblical story. This does not mean that using the same discoveries, one cannot come to other conclusions. Thus, an atheist and a believer looking at the same artifact may conclude that this is an undisputable evidence of his worldview. With this in mind, I invite you to the fourth episode of our series devoted to the mysterious people called Jebusites. This episode will be divided into three parts: the biblical narrative about Jebus and Jerusalem, historical sources relating to Jebus and Jerusalem, Palestinian claims to Jerusalem based on kingship with Jebusites. Today's episode will be a bit longer than the previous ones, but I will try to guide you through the material relatively dynamically. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel to receive notifications about the next episodes on YouTube. So let us begin! In statements by Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, or even the Palestinian Encyclopedia from 1978, you can find the following statement: Palestinians descended from Jebusites, who are of Arab origin. The encyclopedia also describes Jerusalem as an Arab city because its first builders were Cannanite Jebusites, whose descendants are Palestinians. Before we unpack this topic and reflect on the Palestinians themselves, I'd like us to take a look at the information we can get about Jebusites themselves. Who were the people who lived in Jerusalem before King David conquered it? From the genealogy of Noah's descendants in Genesis 9 and 10, we learn that the Jebusites descended from the cursed son Ham, named Canaan, who was destined to become a servant of the other brothers. Jebusites are also mentioned by God in the 23rd chapter of the book of Exodus as a tribe to be exterminated by Israel for their continuous sins and abominations in the Holy Land. In the book of Exodus we read, "For my angel will go before you and bring you into the land of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Cannanites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and I will completely destroy them." In the implementation of the conquest of Canaan, Israel is led by Joshua. In the book of Joshua, chapter 10, we read that a Jebusite, Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, establishes an alliance with Hoham, king of Hebron, Piream, king of Yarmut, Yapit, king of Laish, and Debir, king of Eglon. They all joined together to slay Gibeon, who joined Israel. Joshua and his army did not leave Gibeon and went to the rescue. Joshua's army defeated the Jebusite confederation at Gibeon and pushed them to Bet Horon. From Bet Horon to Azek, we read that God began to drop stones falling from heaven on them. Also, we learn that God stopped the sun in Gibeon and the moon in Ayalon Valley so that the Israelites had time to deal with the enemy army. Eventually, the 5 kings run away and hide in the Makeda cave, where they are found and killed by Joshua and his soldiers. Here I would like to draw attention to the similarity of the name Adonizedek with Melchizedek. Perhaps the Jebusite king Adonizedek was a relative of Melchizedek, or there was a tradition of taking names ending in Zedek. To learn more about Melchizedek, please watch the previous episode. This great victory does not finally deal with the Jebusites, for we read in the book of Joshua chapter 15 that the tribe of Judah cannot drive the Jebusites out of Jerusalem definitely. The same information can be obtained in the first chapter of the book of Judges, where we read that the tribe of Benjamin did not drive the Jebusites out of Jerusalem either. Although in chapter 1 of the same book, we read that Jerusalem or Jebus was conquered and burned by Judah descendants. What does it mean? Does it mean that Jerusalem was not conquered completely? Or could the Jebusites return to Jerusalem after the battle? We simply don't know. Nevertheless, according to the biblical narrative, King David contributes to Jerusalem's complete subjugation of Jerusalem. We'll cover this topic in more detail in the next episode, so I will not focus on these events now. However, I would like to emphasize that even after David's conquest of Jerusalem, the existence of the Jebusites did not end. For example, we read that David buys the threshing floor on Mount Moriah from Araunah the Jebusite to build an altar for God. The identity of the Jebusites is quite mysterious, and it was certainly not a large group of people, but rather a small sub-tribe. The Bible itself gives some clues as to their origins. First, as we learned initially, they descended from the Cannanites and the cursed son of Ham named Canaan. Additional information we find in Ezekiel chapter 16 in verse 3, where we read, "Your origin and your birth are from the land of the Canaanite. Your father was an Amorite, and your mother a Hittite." Looking at the map, it is clear that the Hittites and Amorites circled Jerusalem in the time when Jebusites were the hosts. Indeed, all of those tribes are related and descended from Canaan. Historically, the Hittites and Amorites are more famous than the Jebusites, who we know very little of. On the other hand, the Hittites were also little known, and their existence was doubted until the 20th century, because only the Bible could provide information on their presence. Today we know that the Hittites were an influential nation in Anatolia and with a significant influence in Canaan. We read about the Hittites when Abraham buys a tomb for his wife Sarah in Hebron. So much for the information we find in the Bible about the Jebusites and Jerusalem during this period. Now let's take a look at what history and archaeology tells us about Jebusites. Not a lot can be learned about Jebusites and Jebus. The name Jebus appears only in the publication of Theophilus Pinchas, where he mentions Jebus and interprets it as an old form of Jebus found on the contract plate from 2nd millennium before current era. More often, archaeology identifies the present-day capital of Jerusalem with a name similar to Jerusalem. A term similar to Jerusalem is first mentioned in historical documents discovered in Egypt known as exertion texts. In ancient Egypt, at the time of a ruler's death, priests performed forms of cursing the nation that would dare to rebel against a new pharaoh. These curses were written on pottery dishes or ceramic figures describing a prisoner with his hands tied behind his back. Jerusalem and its kings are listed among the cities and rulers who may rebel against authority. The texts date from the 20th and 19th centuries before current era. The name of the city, Rushalimum, and the two rulers are mentioned. Both names are Semitic. Perhaps it can be inferred from the text that Jerusalem had two groups of people or two clans headed by separate rulers. By synchronizing this information with the conservative Bible chronology, the 20th century is Abraham and Melchizedek's time. Further information about Jerusalem is from the 14th century BC. It comes from the archives of letters discovered at El Marna, Egypt, over a century ago. In a mount near the village of El Marna, farmers digging clay to improve their soil in the fields discovered a collection of letters written in Akkadian cuneiform on burned clay tablets. The diggers by mistake discovered the ruins of Akhenaten city, the capital of Pharaoh Akhenaten, formerly known as Amenhotep IV, who placed the sun god Aten at the head of the Egyptian pantheon. The move was a religious revolution that had significant consequences in Egypt. About 400 tablets were found among the ruins. Some were letters to Pharaoh and his precedor, Amenhotep III. Others were copies of letters he wrote himself. The correspondence was conducted in Akkadian language and writing. Part of the archive contained correspondence between the major powers of the time: Egypt, Hatti, Babylon, and Assyria. However, most of the letters came from the cities of Syria and the Holy Land, which were then vassals of Egyptian authorities, although they enjoyed significant autonomy. The letters show the atmosphere of the 14th century BC, at the time when the Israel tribes conquered the Holy Land. The tablets describe the nomadic gang known as Habiru that roamed Canaan and harassed Egyptian authorities. Following the biblical narrative, some interpret the Habiru community as Hebrews who were conquering Canaan at the time. This information is expressed in the El Marna letters, which repeatedly plead to the supreme authority for weapons to protect Egyptian interest in the seizable Egyptian province of Canaan. One of the letter's writers is a man named Abdiheb of the Judean hills, possibly some ruler of Jerusalem in the 14th century BC. He wrote 6 letters, all asking for weapons and help to protect Egyptian interests from the Habiru and other Cannanites robbers. These letters reveal the status of Jerusalem in the 14th century BC as an essential city in a hill region and the name of the king who ruled it. One of the tablets, called EA 287, says, "Right now, Habiru is trying to conquer Jerusalem, 14th century BC. It is difficult to recognize the name of Abdiheb. However, some say that it is a theophoric name invoking a hurricane mother goddess named Hebat. Again, Ephesus can conclude that Jerusalem could be ruled by several kings or leaders, similarly as the Bible describes it, stating that Jerusalem was conquered by Joshua and the tribe of Judah and governed by the Jebusites. Even when David was king of Jerusalem, he loses power over time, for we read that his son Absalom is rebelling against his father and taking control of Jerusalem. Ultimately, David defeats Absalom in the woods of Ephraim and returns to Jerusalem. In summary, Jerusalem was a city where power changed frequently and could be shared among several leaders or various tribes. Jerusalem could be ruled by Jebusites, Amorites, Hurrites, Hittites, the tribe of Benjamin, and Judah. Internationally, the city was known as Jerusalem, but locally it could take various names, such as Jebus or Salem. With this information in mind, let us return to the Palestinian claims to Jerusalem based on the kinship with the Jebusites. First, let us find out where the name Palestinian comes from. Of course, this is an extensive topic that requires a separate episode. So forgive me, but I will give the information briefly without going into details this time. If you are interested in this topic to be developed, let me know, and maybe we will create an episode that will deal with this matter individually. The name Palestinians derive from the Philistines, a group of people known as the sea people called the Pelasgites by the Egyptians and the Philistines by the Greeks. In the Bible, the Philistines were one of Israel's greatest enemies. The stories of David and Goliath and Samson and Delilah are mostly known, but there are also many other stories in the Bible. Israel fought the Philistines for about 600 years. The existence of the Philistines in Canaan ended with the Babylonian invasion, with King Nebuchadnezzar destroying the cities of Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron. In the Babylonian records from 592 BC, we read that the Philistines are mentioned as Babylonian laborers. The Philistines probably settled in Babylon forever, for we find no description of their return, as it was in the case of the tribe of Judah. The Philistines were not one of Canaan tribes, but visitors from Crete, Greece, or Sardinia. The analysis of several factors confirms this. Clay products found in areas inhabited by the Philistines are very similar to those found in Crete and Greece. DNA tests taken from bones found in ancient cemetery in Ashkelon from 1150 to 1100 BC showed genetic similarity with Crete's inhabitants up to 70%. The Egyptian Tale of Merneptah states that in 1210 BC, in the areas where Philistines were to settle, they were not there yet. However, on the later Egyptian ceramics from 1175 BC, there were pictures of Philistines. In the excavations where the Philistines lived, many bones of animals identified as non-kosher were found, much more than in areas inhabited by Cannanites or Israelites. Philistines were people of different culture than the people that lived in Canaan. The Bible tells us that the Philistines descended from the son of Ham, Put. In Amos chapter 9 and verse 7 we read, "Did I not bring Israel out of the land of Egypt, the Philistine out of Caphtor, and the Amorites out of Kiro?" Caphtor in Akkadian is Kaptara, known in Egypt as Keftyu, from which our name Crete comes. To sum up, the Philistines were probably from Crete and settled on the south coast of Canaan. They had their own culture and rituals, similar to those observed on the Aegean Islands. Their presence in Canaan was eventually cut short by invasions from foreign powers and was never rebuilt. So where does the name Palestine come from? The Canaan region was known to the Greeks as Philistia for many centuries. because it was there that their fellow Philistines settled. The Romans, who inherited the Greek culture, officially named this area Palestine. This followed the Bar Kokhba revolution in the 2nd century AD. It was a reference to the Greek traditions, but also a punishment for the Jewish people by giving the name of their greatest enemies because they rebelled. Successive empires inheriting influence over these areas often returned to the name approved by Rome. This was also the case with the British Mandate, which also referred to this region as Palestine. This only changed after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, although many people still refer to this geographic region as Palestine. So today's Palestinians have chosen a name that has little to do with their nationality. Unless they say they came from Crete or Iraq, they chose this name because of a geographic region, not their identity. And now we can finally deal with the Palestinian claim that they descend from Jebusites. If so, they are referring to the Bible, because the Bible is our main source of information about the Jebusites. Historical sources, as was shown, are silent about them. When they refer to the Bible does not present the Jebusites in a favorable light, to say the least. The Bible even says specifically that this nation has no right to the Holy Land. More to say, no tribe descended from the Cannanites has a right to the Holy Land according to the Bible. Only the descendants of Jacob have the right to own it. It is therefore not a good argument to use. If we discuss this matter on historical basis, well, we know that in history the stronger wins. The Palestinian claim that they own this land because they are descendant from the Jebusites or even the Cannanites is like American Indians who would say that everybody needs to leave America now. Or the British that would say, well, that was our colony at once, so we should own America. No one takes such claims really seriously. Thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this episode. As always, I encourage you to comment. You can also subscribe to this channel to stay informed about the next monthly episodes on the history of Jerusalem. Best regards and see you soon.